The Atheist Debates Patreon project presents Discovering Mythicism with David Fitzgerald.
Woohoo! Good
Woo!
intro. Good
Hey,
intro.
it's live by Hangout. Joining me today is my very good friend David Fitzgerald, who's the author of many, many books, including Nailed. And the subtitle under here is 10 Christian Myths That Show Jesus Never Existed at All.
No
David and I have known each
hyperbole
other.
whatsoever. I really mean that.
See, and that's something. See, you're jumping the gun because I was like, is there any hyperbole there? Nope. David says nope. We've already answered it. This may, in fact, be the first of a series of discussions because mythicism, while it is sort of viewed as a fringe thing, some tiny little box, and maybe there's some kooky nuts people over there, and maybe there's some good arguments, and maybe they're standing in opposition to kind of the de facto status quo. We're going to give credence to stuff we shouldn't. I've never identified as a mythicist. When I'm asked about what my position is on whether or not Jesus existed, I think my normal answer is that I don't care, because if I'm not necessarily convinced that he did exist, and I'm also not convinced that he didn't. I'm kind of in this, there may have been a person, but I think what we'll find out today is that despite the fact that I don't identify as a mythicist, David and I are probably much more on the same page on this with regard to what is and isn't. But I wanted to start by letting David explain to you, from his perspective, what mythicism is and how he came to that position.
Perfect. And that's a great intro to it. In a super, super nutshell, mythicism, in the case of Jesus mythicism, is the idea that Jesus wasn't actually a historical person and that the stories and the gospels that we have about him are made up about someone who didn't actually exist. Very, very small, very long story taken very short. That. And for the longest time, I became an atheist, perfectly happy atheist, perfectly happy historicist. There was no reason for me to it never even crossed my mind that there might have never been a Jesus. I had no inkling that that could be the case. If I had come up to me 20 years ago and told me what I'm telling people today, I probably would have thought it sounded crazy as well. Ironically enough, what got me started as a mythicist from being a historist is trying to parse out what the real Jesus was from the obvious mythological bullshit that's in the Bible. Trying to take the four conflicting gospels and see which one was telling us the truth out of all four of those. And again, very long story, very short. After about 2 years of that process, I began to think, okay, I don't think this guy existed at all. And I was shocked and pleased to find out that I wasn't the only person who had been saying this for a long time. And that, in fact, there were several people in what they called this mythicist community.
Right.
Yeah.
Well, that kind of raises an interesting issue because even earlier when I talk about the fact that I'm not convinced he existed, I'm not convinced he didn't exist, a lot of this has to do with what the hell are we talking about?
Right.
Do we mean, was there a person that existed historically that perhaps stories were glommed onto, and none of the stories are accurate, but the person might still be there?
Right.
I think my major issue with going down that route is that it gets us nowhere. You might as well say that there's a real person at the core of the Arthur myth,
Right.
but everything we know about that person simply isn't true or isn't confirmable. So the only thing we're left with is stuff we don't know.
Exactly. And that's honestly, that is exactly where we are with Jesus. Whether there was a Jesus or not, as Robert Price puts it, for all extents and purposes, there isn't one anymore because all our sources for this person don't link up with anybody who was in the first century. In fact, I like to say, if we're going to say anything, insist that there was a Jesus and know anything about him with any kind of certainty whatsoever, the first question we have to ask is, well, what's our sources for him? How reliable are those sources? What do they actually say? And is there more evidence that the Christians aren't pulling into the question, into the argument?
So when I did this, what I did was I made a list, and this wasn't an exhaustive list because I didn't really put that much effort into it. Because when I say I don't really care,
Yeah.
For me, the fact that this is even reasonably questionable,
Yeah.
Is already a damning issue
For sure.
for Christianity.
For sure.
But I could concede
Yeah.
to them that Jesus existed. I could concede that he said the things the Bible say he says. I
Yeah.
could concede that he did some of the things that the Bible say he said. And that
And,
doesn't mean that I have to accept miraculous accounts. And
right.
even if I did
And you
accept,
can still show that Christianity is BS,
yeah,
even with that assumption. And that's an important thing to point out, that we're going to be perfectly happy atheists whether there was a Jesus or not. And the one thing I want to start out this discussion by saying is that what does make this argument worth having for atheists, not with Christians. Don't have this with your Christian friends. But what makes it worth atheists arguing about is that about historicist and mythicist debate trying to tell us that they know what Jesus thinks or how he wants us to behave or how he wants us to vote. And that's a huge thing, in my
yeah.
humble opinion.
And you kind of broke up there for a minute.
Should I say it all again?
Say it one more time, just in case we didn't get it.
Okay. I'm glad we're having this discussion, because the one point I want to make, that no matter what happens on the historicity mythicist debate, we're going to be fine atheists. That doesn't matter to us. What does make this argument worth having between atheists is that it helps us decide, sorry, take two. Can we do take two?
We can't do take twos. It's live.
It is live. All right. Whatever we learn in the back and forth between the historicists on one side who insist there was a Jesus and the mythicists on the other side who insist there wasn't a Jesus, everything we learn in that back and forth helps us call the bluff of anybody who tries to tell us that we have good idea of what Jesus said or how he wants us to behave or how he wants us to vote. And that's a huge thing.
Sure. And I will happily agree that there's value in that. I think one of my main objections is I can do that without ever discussing whether or not Jesus existed. And I have concerns that some, if not many, in the mythicist camp go too far. I just made a post the other day warning people to stop exaggerating, to stop engaging in hyperbole, because it actually damages your position. If, you know, whether or not there was a Jesus, if you say,
we have no evidence.
No, there was no Jesus.
Yeah.
And actually what you really mean is you can't show that there was.
Yes.
You've exaggerated. And it's not, you could go further than that and say, Jesus was invented in the 4th century by the Pope and the Masons, something that Acharya once advocated for. And now I think that you're way off in conspiracy theories.
Exactly. And
so I try
people sorry, I lost you for a second.
I'm just saying I try to stay as far away from that as possible, which is why I say, I could concede, technically, I could concede that Jesus existed, that the Bible accurately reports his words, and that he performed every miracle he performed, and that still doesn't demonstrate that he was in fact divine, because it doesn't explain how those things were done. Now that's farther than I would actually go.
Sure, and that's farther than I'd be comfortable too. But the point is, I mean, it doesn't really matter for us whether there's Jesus or not. But for me, this issue is fascinating. Seeing where Christianity really came from is amazing to me. And knowing that we can't really get a grasp on how Christianity began and how it evolved without going down this route, that's important. And there's another thing that happened to me completely by accident as a side effect of looking into Jesus' story. And that was, I heard from Buddhist scholars and I heard from ex-Muslim scholars who said, you know what? We're having these exact same arguments in our circles about whether Buddha existed and whether Muhammad existed. And that blew my mind.
Okay, and that is shocking to me, and that I don't like. I think it would be kind of just patently obvious that we have far more evidence for an actual historical Muhammad.
I would totally agree. And when I asked, well, what's that being driven by? And when they said, well, here's the thing, all our sources for Muhammad are, and he goes into, a 5-minute talk and says, okay, this is sounding a lot more like Jesus now, because all our evidence for Muhammad comes from these hadiths, which are supposedly hunted down all the way to eyewitnesses, and none of them quite make that. None of them have been found to be authentic. They've all been dismissed.
This is where we get closer to the problem that I have, which is The fact that we don't have reliable information for something doesn't mean that we can conclude that it's not true.
True, but it's not simply a case that we don't have good evidence that there was a Jesus. We also do have evidence that there may not have been a Jesus, and we can get into that as well. And in fact, that's
And
one of the things that makes me think that this really should be an ongoing series, because there are a lot of rabbit holes to run down this.
yeah, and I'm figuring that we'll probably get into some of them. I think
Yeah.
so this is the way I kind of viewed this earlier. If you were to take a list of everything that's reported about Jesus,
Yeah.
and you could do this for Muhammad or Siddhartha Buddha or whoever, some of that information is mundane.
Right.
Hey, this was a person who lived in this area. There's nothing remotely remarkable about that. And some of it is extraordinary.
Yeah.
And of course, the extraordinary claims are going to require extraordinary evidence, and they don't have it. So there's no reason to believe those. But the mundane things, it seems to me that if we're going to be fair, if we're going to be good skeptics and good historians, that if you removed all the extraordinary things from Jesus and just left the mundane things,
Yeah.
to say that this person didn't exist goes against what we do for everybody else in history. For anybody else in history, the mundane things we just accept at face value.
Except in the case of Jesus, our evidence also goes against the mundane things. Some of the most basic things about Jesus' life, we don't have good evidence for, and we have countermanding evidence and
Like, all right,
non-corroborating
give me an
evidence.
example.
Well, for instance, just the evolution of his story, his birth, his biographical information. The early Christianity, for the first generation, 2 generations, maybe 3 generations, we don't see any of that. We only see the beginning of biographical information for Jesus with the Gospel of Mark. The Gospel of Mark, once that appears, all of a sudden it kicks off a whole slew of other Gospels. By the time Luke writes his Gospel, he says, oh, so many people are writing Gospels now. It seemed like a good idea for me to get the real story. And so he rips off Mark and Matthew and claims that he's written the real story of Jesus. But when you look at Paul's Jesus and you look at the Jesus of everybody else in the ancient world before Mark writes that gospel, for instance, the author of the book of Hebrews, all the other letters that were legitimately written before the gospels were written, not to be confused with the ones that were forged after the gospels were written, you see a complete lack of biographical information for Jesus. And you see that we've got people who are supposed to be Jesus's friends and family, and yet Paul treats them like they're not even real Christians, or that they have no better connection to Jesus than he does. And he also claims that the gospel was this mystery that's been hidden except by preachers like him and apostles like him. And when he says apostle, he's not talking about a disciple of Jesus. He never uses the word disciple in any context whatsoever, anytime. What he says is an apostle is somebody like him who's read the Bible, has had visions of God's Spirit speaking to him, and can do miracles. There's nothing about any connection to an earthly Jesus in what he's saying. And what he was preaching, because he constantly says that he didn't get his gospel from any man, and he warns us about following the gospels of other Jesuses and other Christs, sounds a lot like what we get in the book of Hebrews. And that's a Jesus who does everything on the spiritual plane, in the heavens, and is our heavenly high priest, and is compared and contrasted with the priests on earth. So there's weird. I mean, biblical historians have always talked about this silence of Paul, and it's not just Paul. It's every Christian author that we still have, and it's weird that for the most part, for the first almost 100 years of Christianity, we only have Paul. That's a weird thing in and of itself. So there's all kinds of bizarre absences and just a different portrayal of Jesus altogether. We get this mythological Jesus who's in the heavens and was at the dawn of time, but we don't get any mundane information about Jesus.
So I think that kind of perhaps sidesteps the point, because when I'm talking about the mundane things about him, it's
go ahead.
it doesn't matter Like this, everything about Paul and Peter, which I have some concerns about that I'll get to in a minute. None of that matters, because if we were told this person existed and did certain things, and we only had one account of that, the default perspective as a historian is that if someone is spoken about as if they, were a historical figure, hey, Jim Bob's brother Jeff over here owned the peanut store down the street. We just by default accept that Bob's brother Jeff existed and owned the peanut store.
Well, there's two things I want to say about that, because that's not quite right. Not quite right. For one thing, even the mundane information that we're given him generations later doesn't agree with itself, and there's contradictions. So it's a question of, well, who believing and what are they saying? But another thing is we have a writing of something. All historical writings for all historical people are met with initial suspicion, not with initial acceptance. And we only accept them in proportion to the amount of corroborating evidence that they have, and those lines of evidence they have, and how many there are, and what the claim is being made. It's one thing to say, oh, we have an account of Aesop, who was a slave. It's another thing to say, oh, these stories were collected over hundreds of years. You can't just say, as Christian apologists say all the time, that we just automatically accept any writing. The opposite is true.
Okay, I couldn't possibly disagree with you more. Because this is after discussions with many, many historians. If somebody says, hey, this person's brother owned a peanut store in Georgia, the default position is to accept that as true until such times you have reason to not accept that that's true, because this is something that you can't investigate, and you don't have a time machine, and you don't have any corroborating things, and there's absolutely nothing extraordinary about
exactly. There's absolutely nothing extraordinary. And when you take the story of Jesus, even what the things that are mundane in there are put in there for the sake of a story that has extraordinary things. For instance,
that's a conclusion based on.
And I'll tell you why. Because when you take them out, and apologists have done this for generations, they say, oh, all we have to do, not apologists, but secular historians say, okay, to find a real Jesus, we just have to take out all the things that are clearly mythological, and what's left is surely mundane and was the real Jesus. Would you agree with that?
No, I would say whatever's left is something that
we can accept.
No, I would say that whatever's left, if it's mundane claims that would be accepted for any other figure that didn't have extra stuff glommed onto them, you can't have a justification for rejecting those, because now you'll be in a state where you are accepting mundane claims if there's nothing extraordinary surrounding them, and then rejecting mundane claims when there's extraordinary around them.
I'm gonna put a pin in that argument, but what I'm gonna say is, in the case of Jesus, even the mundane things that seem to be completely reasonable, like that he found a fig tree and cursed it because figs were out of season.
I wouldn't put that in the mundane at all.
Okay, what mundane things are we talking about? Because we may be agreeing with each other.
Whether or not there was a person who had a family who lived in a particular era, and this gets back to what you're talking to with regard to Paul. When Paul goes to meet with Peter and James, who he refers to as apostles, he has no reason to go meet with them unless he's meeting with people who he viewed as having some relationship with the person that we're talking about.
Well, according to his own writings, that's not why he went. He went because he wanted to see who the Jerusalem pillars were, and it went into reaction to their summons, and he opposes them throughout the whole book of Galatians.
He challenges them on some points of doctrine, but it's not like he speaks of them as if they're frauds who don't know.
He does. In fact, he says they're bringing false believers. I don't know who these guys think they are, but to me, they were nothing.
Okay.
I'm just saying.
I'll have to dig in on that. But at the end of the day, this is why I was waiting to get back to that in a minute.
Right.
Because I want what's mundane.
Yeah.
If you take away everything that is extraordinary about the story of Jesus, what you're left with is a story that the elements of which we would accept for almost anybody else, and to reject them and not the other is hypocritical. I mean, in your case, what you said was,
what I'm saying is,
what you said a minute ago was that the mundane things were invented to support the extraordinary claims.
No. They are interwoven with these extraordinary claims that when you take away the extraordinary part, in most cases, you're destroying the whole reason for which the story was told.
Okay, but I'm not concerned about the reason for which the story was told.
But you should be, because what it's saying is we're trying to glean historical information from allegorical stories. We're trying to glean historical information from stories that are clearly taken, sometimes word for word, from the Hebrew scriptures or even from pagan sources. You're looking at me as if I've said something crazy to you.
I feel like, once again, we are talking about two completely different things. Okay, we have all right, am I going to finish? If we have stories about Jesus.
Yeah. Or anybody.
Sure, anybody.
Yeah.
And the elements of a story about person A, and if they are similar in type and content to the elements of story about person B, and we reject it for A because there's extra stuff that pollutes it, and we don't reject it for B, we no longer have a good standard. We are being hypocritical.
I take your point, and what I'm saying is when we remove the extraordinary things from Jesus, we are left with something that doesn't look anything like what we think Jesus is supposed to be like.
That doesn't matter.
We're not left with anything that would explain how Christianity arose.
And that's irrelevant too. I am not talking about, if you remove all this stuff and you get nothing that looks like Jesus and nothing that talks about Christianity.
Yeah.
That's not what I'm talking about. I'm talking about whether or not it is fair to say that this person did not exist and to say that this person did exist if we only view the mundane things about them. Set aside Christianity, set aside the extraordinary claims. If you just took the mundane facts, you would not conclude, hey, this person didn't exist. That's not what we would do for anybody else. We are only doing that because there are these extraordinary things about him, and because there is a suspicion that the mundane and the extraordinary were merged together in order to build Christianity. And I'm saying, even if that were true, it doesn't mean there's not a real person there. It doesn't mean that there wasn't a Yeshua ben Joseph who walked around and preached as an itinerant rabbi.
You're saying you've talked to many historians, and they assure you that that's not how they operate. And I don't know what to tell you, but I can't think of any historical figure, full stop, that's not supported by major types of evidence. And we proportionally give our provisional assent to their historicity according to how well they're supported by these. I don't know anyone who says, oh, well, of course there was a fill in the blank.
No. Okay.
Especially for the ancient world.
This is the confusion. It's not, of course there was. It is about assigning what the default position is going to be and where the burden of proof rests. And the default position for historians is that if someone is written about and represented as if they were a real figure, then the default position is to accept that they were a real figure until such time as there's reason to believe that that's not the case.
And well, I would say, hey, first of all, yes, we do have reason to believe that. But first of all, I mean, I want to do a shout, a lifeline to Richard Carrier and ask him, because I think you're saying things that he's flatly denied in his book. And again, I don't know any historian who would say it that way.
First of all, it has to be that way, because if the opposite is to believe that nobody existed until you have sufficient
until you have sufficient evidence. Exactly.
So then that would put us in a position where, for the overwhelming majority of everyone who has ever existed, our default position is they didn't exist.
No, our default position is we have this evidence for them. It doesn't sound too crazy. It's probably true.
No. Okay, wow. I think you just did an inversion to get back to what I was saying. Either the default position for someone in history is that they existed until we have reason to think they didn't, or they didn't exist until we have reason to think they did. Now, you would think that the default position would be the second one, that they did, we don't confirm that somebody existed or believe that somebody existed until we have evidence that they did. However, what stands as evidence for a person existing is an incredibly mundane easy to satisfy burden, which is if you say George Washington's brother Peter owned the eyeglass shop down the street, then the default position is to accept that that is true until such times we have reason to believe that it's not true. Because
okay,
otherwise,
let me just put a pin in that for just a second, unless you need to finish that thought.
go ahead.
Okay, here's the thing. That's not what we have for Jesus. We don't have any kind of biographical information at all for the first almost century of Christianity. What we have is something talking about someone who is not a human being. And the fact that it goes from early believers in different contexts, talking in different ways about a figure who's not even meant to be on earth, going from that to something where we have biographical information that seems to be highly allegorical, highly theologically coded, and not meant to be taken literally.
Are you there?
All the biographical information we have for this person, decades after, away from the citing of the story. It's hard to think of a historical figure that we have such bad evidence for.
There's countless historical figures that we have no evidence for, is the point.
I should say, compared to what's being claimed for them. Compared to what's being claimed for them.
This is what you're not getting, David. Stop. Pause.
Okay.
You broke up there for a second. I don't give a damn what's being claimed about Jesus from a theological standpoint and everything. I specifically am saying, if you make a list of everything about Jesus and you remove all the things that are theological, all of the things that are miraculous, and leave only the mundane, that there was a guy who was an itinerant rabbi in the first century, there's nothing remotely extraordinary about that. It is almost certainly true. And even if we had no evidence for any aspect of their life, the mere fact that somebody said, hey, I met an itinerant rabbi named Yeshua ben Joseph, or whatever, the default position would be to accept that that person is accurately relaying an experience they had and that this person likely existed.
Stop. I want to stop you there. When you say they're likely giving a experience that they had, we don't have anything remotely like that. We have nothing that even claims to be by eyewitnesses. Nothing for the first 3 generations of this person's life. Whereas we do have evidence for loser messiahs, wannabe, all these itinerant rabbis. There's nothing implausible about there being an itinerant rabbi named Jesus, and that was the, there's nothing implausible about that. Do I think that's what the case is? Absolutely not. Absolutely not. So, I mean, I'm willing to grant you, yes, that's a good rule of thumb, but that's
all I've been saying for the last 10 minutes, that the default rule of thumb for historians.
I don't think that is, but let's put that aside, because
okay, how could it be anything else? How could the opposite be true? That the default rule of thumb for historians is to not believe that anybody existed until such time.
I'm not saying not believe they don't existed, but to weigh give your provisional account in weighing according to the claim and the evidence you have for it.
No,
that's all I'm saying. That's all I'm saying.
We're talking about how to establish a burden of proof. Is the burden of proof on this person existed until they didn't, or is this burden of proof on this person did not exist until they did?
I'm assuming that the burden of proof is on me, because I'm saying that Jesus didn't exist, and many people believe it. But that's the logistical framework behind that isn't what interests me. I agree that the burden of proof is on me just because I'm saying something that's considered fringe and on the periphery. Okay.
That is the default burden of proof with respect to any. Get rid of the person. Get rid of anything. With respect to any claim that happened in the past, we don't have a time machine. We have to go on what's reported. And with respect to any claim in the past, what historians do is look at it and say, first of all, do we believe it until there's reason to not believe it? Or do we not believe it until there's reason to believe it?
Gotcha.
Not quite that simple, because the claims fall into different categories.
Exactly.
So if somebody says, hey, I had, so-and-so had a brother, that's mundane. If somebody says, hey, so-and-so was abducted by aliens, that's not mundane.
Right.
So there's different standards of evidence for those things. But by default, if a person is presented as if this were a real encounter, that we're not engaged in some sort of, it's not a Paul Bunyan story or whatever else.
Well, wait a second. Stop right there. Because what I'm saying is, for the first almost 100 years of Christianity, It is being presented as a Paul Bunyan story. It is being presented as somebody who's not even on Earth.
Aspects of it are, but that doesn't mean that. Okay.
What aspects are you thinking of? Because I honestly, even when you're talking about Paul, which is the closest we get to an eyewitness, never talks about.
This is this crap that Lacona pulled during the debate. Paul, okay, we don't know who wrote the Gospels.
Right. But we do know about when they wrote it, and we do know things about them by context.
I understand that.
Sure.
But if in fact Jesus was a real historical figure,
yeah,
then the authors of the Gospels either talked to eyewitnesses or had information from eyewitnesses and would have been closer than Paul.
Stop.
Paul,
because
hang on.
Okay.
Paul, if let's begin with the assumption Jesus existed as a historical figure. Just begin with that for the sake
sure. For the sake of argument, absolutely.
That means Paul never met this person, but Paul did meet with people who would have met this person.
If in fact there was a person for him to meet. Again, he never makes any connection to these guys to Jesus.
It does. Okay, but that's, you see, now you're going with a Paul primacy. Let's live in this fictional narrative for a second. If there was a historical Jesus, Paul never met him, but Paul did meet people who met him.
Right.
Okay.
And for 14 years, he was preaching and saying he got his gospel from no person. He also presents the Lord's Supper as though no one would have heard about this if he wasn't telling us this right now.
Yeah, this is reading into stuff. I'm talking to, okay. Why is this so damn difficult?
And I feel like we're agreeing violently for the most part. It's like,
if there was a historical Jesus,
okay, let's go with that.
Paul never met him, but Paul met people who met him. That's just
okay.
Setting aside how they talked about him or what was spoken or anything else that wants to distract you on Paul.
Sure.
Begin with Jesus existed as a person.
Yeah.
Paul never met him, but Paul met people who met him.
Let's run with that for argument's sake.
I'm not using that for argument's sake. I'm just trying to say under this model, that is
right.
true.
Yes. Okay. I'm with you.
If you begin then with Jesus never existed,
well,
then neither Paul nor the people Paul. What?
Go ahead. But it seems like it's quite a leap to go from here's a fictional narrative and now if you believe that Jesus existed. But go ahead.
There are two possibilities, David. Either Jesus existed as a historical figure or he didn't.
Yeah. Okay.
Under the model that he did, that means Paul did not meet him, but Paul met people who met him.
Right.
Under the model that he didn't, that means neither Paul nor the people Paul met ever met Jesus.
Yes, we are completely in agreement.
Okay. Do we have accounts from the people Paul met? Peter, for example.
We do not. We have ones forged in their name decades after the fact, generations after the fact even.
What is the likelihood that those things accurately represent Peter's thoughts?
What things are we talking about? Are you talking the book of Peter?
The forgeries that you're talking about, which I'm not necessarily convinced are forgeries, but we can get, that's another topic.
Sure. What ask me the question again? What's the likelihood that those are presenting Peter's actual thoughts?
Yeah, Peter's position. I mean, somebody wrote this.
Yeah.
Okay. And somebody wrote about these apostles and somebody wrote the Gospels.
Right.
If we begin with a primacy of Paul, then I think I would agree with you far more than I do. I don't think the fact that because Paul's writings were earlier, that we should have a Paul-based primacy when there are other perspectives to consider from here.
Gotcha. I think I see one thing you're saying, because you are saying we have an epistle of Peter, we have epistle of Jude, and all these other writings, which are in no better historical shape than the forgeries that we get from Paul.
I agree. I think, I agree that it's a mess. I agree that all of it is unreliable. What I think I'm talking about here is that the mythicists seem to go, well, we'll put a primacy on Paul because it's the earliest. And Paul seems to want to dismiss all these other apostles and everything. And I'm saying, I don't know what the justification for that is, because there's two models. Either Jesus existed, in which case the apostles that Paul met with would be better sources, even though we don't have their accounts, but they would be better sources. Sure. And if Jesus didn't exist, then we have no justification for determining whether Paul or the people Paul met should be considered primary sources. because neither of them met him.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And I think maybe, I mean, you haven't read Jesus Mything in Action, have you?
I read part of it.
Okay.
That's Bob's book, right?
No, that's my book. That's my
No,
book.
okay.
Mything in Action.
Now there was another one from Price that I started reading. I have not read Mything in Action.
Gotcha.
But
what's that?
I have read Nailed. I actually have it here.
Yeah, Nailed is good, but the problem with Nailed is it doesn't get into anything really arguing for why I think that. It's the top 10 ways that the official Christian story fails. And I get so much pushback from people saying, oh yeah, I know that. There wasn't really a son of God, Jesus, but there really was a guy named Jesus. Nailed doesn't get into that very well at all. Jesus Mything in Action was written exactly for atheists who try to tell me we have good evidence to believe in Jesus.
Oh, see, now that's...
Or any evidence.
First of all, we should recommend people go read Mything in Action, Jesus Mything in Action, and Nailed. But I'm not an atheist telling you we have good reason to believe Jesus exists. I'm an atheist who's saying I think mythicists have gone too far in what they're asserting, purely with respect to sound epistemology. And did I lose you?
Can you hear me? Can you hear me? Yeah, you lost me as soon as you said, I'm not telling you you're something.
Yeah, I'm not telling you. I'm not an atheist who's telling you we have reason to believe that Jesus existed. I'm an atheist. I'm a skeptic.
Yeah.
Who is saying, from the standpoint of sound epistemology, burden of proof, and claims, and what we should and shouldn't claim, mythicists have gone too far. Because if you say, Jesus never existed, that's a positive assertion that you need to demonstrate. And if the demonstration is to say, oh, well, these are unreliable sources and we have no historical stuff, and we don't even have the sort of things that we could reasonably conclude that a non-divine, reported being is there, and then you've added all this other stuff on there. I agree with all of the objections.
Right.
Just not the way the conclusion is framed.
You know what? And I'm okay with that. I can live with that. And maybe we could end this series right at that moment. Just that's where we disagree. But what I would love to do is talk about the reasons why evidence we do have doesn't point to a real Jesus. It's not just an argument from silence. It's not just an argument from our bad sources. It's an argument from, this is what our sources seem to have come from. And this is what they seem to have been constructed to do. And this is how we know they're constructed. And this is what they're constructed from. Those questions to me are so much more interesting.
Yeah.
And fascinating.
And I think, well, granted, we will definitely come back to this and start there at some point, because I think one of the key things is to say, to look at, so a lot of this, and you can correct me if I'm wrong here, because this is just my impression. A lot of this has to do with, if we look at other things that we generally consider to be myths, constructed intentional myths, there are hallmarks in the way the narratives are constructed. There are incredible, not just the Joseph Campbell myth and hero thing, but there's a pattern of how stories develop.
I so want to stop you. I so want to pause you for just a moment, because absolutely, you're totally right. And we do have a template, if you will, of typical myth themes that we find in hero figures and in savior figures. And when you match other people up, like Julius Caesar, Alexander the Great, King Arthur, Robin Hood, real people never seem to get above a 6 or a 7 on this scale, the Rankin-Ross scale. Fictional characters start getting into the double digits. Jesus is clear at the top, up with Moses and Theseus. He's one of the highest ranking ones there. In fact, he's arguably the highest ranking one there.
Yeah.
That fact alone is what you're talking about, that he doesn't conform to a mundane figure. And we have loads of mundane savior wannabe messiahs from the first century. It's not like it's a crazy idea. There could have been an itinerant Jewish preacher. It's just that we have at least 15 of them that I mentioned in the book that we do know about and people did take notice of. And yet all these loser messiahs who aren't half as interesting as our Jesus did something that he couldn't do, and that's get corroboration from outside his cult. That's huge to me. The fact that he conforms so strongly to this mythical archetype is huge for me. There's so many other things. The fact that that our first biographical information doesn't show up until generations after Christianity's been on the scene, and when it shows up, it seems to be a very low frills, human, fallible Jesus who becomes adopted at his baptism and is exalted to Christ and Lord. but it seems to be constructed 100% out of allegory taken from the Jewish scriptures. All those things blow my mind, and it's like trying to pin down, trying to get at the human being that could have sponsored such a thing, could have sparked such a thing. I said the nail at the very end that for me, the fact that you've got a guy who either taught these amazing things, if not did all these amazing miracles, and yet nobody outside his house cult noticed for the better part of a century, or he didn't do these things, he didn't teach these amazing things, and yet as soon as he's dead, you've got these feuding little house cults, not just in Galilee, not just in Jerusalem, but scattered all over the Roman Empire, and they can't agree about the basic things of his life, like who his 12 apostles were, or what his biographical information was, or even what he taught. It's hard for me to even think that there could have been a real person to sponsor something like that, to be the catalyst for something like that. And
this is exactly what I was getting at. That
yeah,
and we can go through this. I tell you what, we can go through this a little bit next time. But what I was getting to was mostly what you just said, and I'm in agreement with that. If you were to take this sort of scale where we determine is something more probably myth than not, then I agree. Jesus is way the hell up there. As a matter of fact, it's preposterous. It's absolutely outlandish claims. Of course, he's going to be at or near the top. He's claimed to be God, and he's performing miracles all over the place, and the miracles that don't seem to be recorded by anybody else. It's as absurd as a global flood.
Sure.
However, we have good reason to think not only that a global flood didn't happen, but that a global flood did not, in fact, happen.
Sure.
Okay, because of the nature of that, it's a physical event, and because of that, there's a lot of requirements that are preposterous. However, there's nothing necessarily preposterous about an itinerant Jewish rabbi, and I don't think that Jesus had to spark these stories. I think it may be the case that these stories were sparked in the realm of myth and glommed onto somebody.
And Kurt Knoll agrees with you. He says we can account for early Christianity whether there was a real Jesus or whether there wasn't. He doesn't think that's an important question either.
Yeah. However, it's an interesting one.
It is an interesting one. It's fascinating.
My biggest point. So, and we didn't really get to the two or more camps of mythicists.
Oh, at least. Yeah, there's so much more.
Because there's a camp, and I want to clear this up before we close today's out.
Yeah.
There is a clear group of people who I have no problem at all are saying are engaged in a level of conspiracy theorist nuttery.
With you. Are we talking about Joseph Atwill and his Roman invented
Messiah? Basically, the people who are claiming that everything about Christianity was an intentional forgery invented centuries after by the Pope and the Masons or whatever else.
And I can't tell you, I would rather debate Christians than deal with that nonsense, because if you can concoct this cockamamie story, you should know right from the get-go that you have to ignore decades, if not centuries, of a religious evolution and evidence to make that work.
Yeah.
And yet this guy is still cranking out his book, and I still get that meme every, quarter or so and have to say, look, this is bullshit. Because not all myth theory is created equal, for sure.
This is the road I went down with Zeitgeist, which is just awful, and the astrotheology and stuff like that. Now, this is what Acharya was pushing earlier in her career.
Yeah.
And it prompted me to talk to Bob Price probably a little more than a decade ago.
Yeah.
Because they were both fellows for the Committee for the Scientific Examination of Religion, and
so was I.
He had reported a really negative review of her book that basically said that she never met a conspiracy theory she didn't like. Now, later on, evidently either her scholarship improved or Bob's declined, and they became friends and maybe, kind of friendly adversaries about stuff. I genuinely think that later on she got perhaps less conspiratorial.
I do too, but by then the damage was done and her personality cult was in full bore.
Yeah, and her fans, I'm sure her fans are going to be coming after me for even mentioning her here. I don't want to make a list of here are the good mythicists and here are the bad mythicists, because I don't want to make this about the people.
Gotcha.
Going through and getting so that we agree that there are some claims that are just like way over the top.
Right.
What we don't agree is at what point does something become too over the top or perhaps counterproductive to claim. Like for me, I don't believe there's a God.
Right.
And for every God that I've been presented with, for any God that I can potentially assess, I actually believe those gods do not exist. I'm not absolutely certain. I'm not going to defend that position most of the time because
Yeah.
the burden of proof needs to be on the person claiming there's a God.
Right.
But when it comes to did Jesus exist, I give the answer that I gave earlier. Because if I were to say, I'm convinced that Jesus didn't exist, now all of a sudden I've adopted a burden of proof instead of making them meet theirs. And
Right.
if I can sit here all day long and expose every flaw in every attempt for them to prove that Jesus existed with all of the information that you're using,
Yeah.
then it seems to me it would be a strategic mistake to make the positive assertion to put myself on defense.
And fair cop. Yeah, absolutely. Here's where I'm coming from. At the end of the day, I agree with those scholars who say it doesn't matter whether Jesus existed or not because we can account for early Christianity with or without him. But what I am saying is that when you look at the ways that our Christianity and our history of Jesus and our biography of Jesus, where it comes from and how it unfolds and how it evolves, it's so hard for me to even provisionally a real guy. Your image is frozen up. Did you lose me?
You're here.
Okay. Um, that for again, as Price said, for all extents and purposes, there isn't a Jesus anymore, and that's what I want. That's what I want people to know is that if they think that that we have evidence, because Christians are constantly pumping out misinformation about what we know and
Sure.
the surety that we know it about Jesus, the best way to fight against that is to point out, well, no, this story is actually taken from the Old Testament. This story didn't show up until the 4th century. These things, the synoptic problem is a huge thing. It's a huge problem for apologists. It's not a problem for us. It's the synoptic. Well, isn't that interesting fact? But the synoptic problem is a huge problem for Christians.
Well, yeah, and I've one of my favorite things for years, and this is why I say I don't have any need to go down necessarily the mythicist route, is I keep presenting the Easter challenge to everybody. Please reconcile the gospel accounts on Easter.
Absolutely. Thank you, Dan Barker. That's one of my favorite things ever. Yeah.
Yeah. And I love the thing that you cited from Bob Price that, whether or not there was a Jesus, there isn't one now.
Yeah.
That okay, I was going to say very clearly gets to, but it may not be clear to believers. You might have to explain it a bit. But essentially the point is, if you take the mass of things that are claimed about Jesus, some of them, it would be fair to say, not only do I not believe them, but I believe they must that they're false because miracle claims without any supporting evidence, we dismiss that for everybody else. So it would be fair to dismiss it for Jesus as well.
This is the thing.
Then you put together the narrative and you get something that is much more like myth making and myth building than any story of events.
Absolutely.
And the complete lack of corroborating evidence for everything, from the zombies rising up out of the grave to the temple to earthquakes to the sun standing. Nothing about this is corroborated anywhere other than these century later messages.
Yeah. And it's fascinating to see how these gospels are constructed. In the same way, it's fascinating to see the Achilles heels of the rest of the New Testament and how much of that is problematic as well. And again, the Old Testament is just as problematic, and this is not just a Christian problem. I mean, all religions, I think, have the same. I'm further and further convinced that all religions, the major religions, are coming about and evolving in the same fashion.
Yeah, I think I think there may even be a better case for Moses being myth, not only because it's older and there's less material and there's less, it's not like we have various gospels and things about
Moses. Yeah.
So what we have is, hey, he was the leader of the people, but the mundane events are clearly in some cases false. The idea that they were enslaved in Egypt and there's no cultural synchronization, and that they escaped and were led by pillars of cloud by day and fire by night and manna from heaven and all this stuff.
And he was found in the basket in the river, just like Sargon, the second head, did 1,000 years earlier. Yeah.
Does this mean that I'm convinced that there wasn't someone named Moses? No. Does it mean I'm convinced that there wasn't a leader of the Jewish people at some time that became kind of, mythicized and propped up. No, there may have been
Maybe.
whatever's left there.
Yeah.
The Jesus of story and the Moses of story.
Right.
Not only is there no good reason to believe that the stories, which essentially become the construct of the character, are real,
Yeah.
but there is good reason to think that those stories are not real.
Right. And that is exactly my take. That's exactly my take on Jesus, which I agree you don't have to agree with, but that is exactly where I'm coming from.
No, I think we're on the same page there. And
I
on
do
that
too.
note, what we'll do is we'll wait for some feedback from some people on the Patreon project, and specifically what questions you have about mythicism that you'd like to see David and I address. And maybe we can pull Richard Carrier in here. Maybe we can pull somebody in who knows far more about this than me, who is also not a mythicist, because this is not remotely my area of expertise. It's just something
For sure.
that I'm interested in. And when
For
I sit
sure.
down and we go head to head on Bible stuff, I have particular perceptions of Paul and Paul's interactions with Peter, etc., which I have to begin by acknowledging are informed by the Southern Baptist upbringing as much as they are independent study. So
yours and mine both. Yours and mine both. The Southern Baptist Dave is still very strong in my head, and that's constantly my default. And it's interesting to realize that default of ours is just the one that won out on top of many other constructions.
Yeah, and those sorts of things are good too. So we'll wait for some feedback from patrons about this conversation, about what kind of questions they want to ask David. Perhaps maybe we can get Richard Carrier in or somebody else in, and do some more where we touch on specific things. And I think while there's lots of interesting discussions, and I'm sure we'll have them, I think one thing that would be useful, because this project is particularly focused on debates, is to give both the strongest points and the best ways to make them, as well as don't do this type of thing, because you're stepping into a minefield when you go down this, Christianity was invented in the 4th century by the Pope. I mean, we already touched on that. That one makes me laugh so hard, because how the hell did you get a Pope?
It's just, don't get me started. Don't get me started on that one.
On that note, I want to thank David Fitzgerald for joining us. I've got some more videos coming up, and I'm sure we'll be doing some more of this again. So thank you, sir, and have a good day.
You too. Thanks again. Talk to you soon.
This video is made possible by supporters of the Atheist Debates Patreon project. You can find more information and add your support at patreon.com/atheistdebates.